Welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Kim. He's Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies right there in Waikiki. Our show today is called The Turbulent Peninsula, Korea. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kim back to the show. He's previously been with us, and he always has something very interesting to tell us. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you. Well, South Korea, North Korea, there's never a lack of excitement on the Korean Peninsula. It's always something happening.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. Let's start off by taking a look at South Korea. And I read a very interesting article in The Economist a few weeks ago, and it was titled something like Park Geun-hye's administration is fragile, but the opposition is in shambles. Did you happen to see that article?
No, I didn't.
Well, just from that title, would you agree or disagree?
If I were to describe the current political situation in South Korea, I wouldn't exactly use the same adjectives as used in that article.
Okay.
The current administration, Park Geun-hye's administration, has some challenges, and you would have thought that the opposition party would benefit politically from some of the problems that the administration is undergoing, but they have not benefited politically from some of the problems facing the current administration. So I think this is the current situation, but then I don't think it's an atypical situation. I think the public is frustrated politically.
In what sense?
I think, first of all, that they're dissatisfied with the political gridlock in South Korea. They believe that the political parties, instead of putting the interests of the people forefront in their agenda, they're engaged in political wrangling and trying to engage in one-upmanship. So therefore, I think this is fueling the dissatisfaction of the Korean public regarding not only the ruling party, but also the opposition party. And that's why the opposition party hasn't really benefited politically from some of the problems that facing Park Geun-hye's administration.
Did she handle the sinking of that ferry very well? Could she have handled that better? Did this contribute to her woes?
I think I think that has hurt the government politically. The support for the Park Geun-hye regime fell as a result of the public perception that the government mishandled this terrible disaster. So all of the deficiencies within the government in dealing with this type of disaster, I think, was revealed to the public. And the public, and given the enormity and the tragedy of that particular disaster, I think this has fueled perception that this government is incompetent and could have done a lot better job in handling the crisis.
If she were a man, would it be a different situation? I mean, she's the first woman to be president of the Republic of Korea. Still in lots of places in Asia, women haven't ascended to the highest level. Would the situation be different if she were a man?
I don't think so. I think her gender did not in any way make the public less confident of her leadership, didn't make the public more critical of the handling of this disaster. So I don't think I don't think that's a major political factor affecting how the public views the effectiveness or the performance of this government.
How about her father's legacy? Has that in any way hurt her? For the benefit of our audience, we should say that her father, Park Chung-hee, it depends on who you talk to, I think. Some people would say if it weren't for him, Korea wouldn't be the economic power that it is today. Others would say that he was a brutal dictator, terribly authoritarian.
I think the Korean public as a whole, I think that is not a major consideration in evaluating her presidency. But I think there are groups within South Korean society, especially the people in their 30s and possibly in the early 40s, that were involved in the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s, and therefore extremely critical of of course, the military government, President Chung-hee, which was essentially a military government. I think that particular group within society, I think, probably have critical views of her father, despite the many accomplishments and his contribution to the economic development of Korea. So therefore, I think, yes, that could color the views of the current government.
Former leaders of countries have a bad tendency to still want to stay involved, and sometimes they interfere. How about Lee Myung-bak? What's his? Does he play any kind of role today? Does he try to interfere, or is he completely retired? Is he out of politics? He ceases to show interest in politics? And does he pop up every now and then and kind of get in the way?
He's been very quiet. I don't know what he's thinking, and I don't know if he has lost any interest in Korean politics. Probably not. But he has not been visible.
He hasn't heard anything about it.
That's right. He's been very quiet. Has not made any public statements that I'm aware of regarding the current administration. No, I don't know if that's unusual. Usually, I think, especially if you happen to be the president, like Lee Myung-bak, without that long interval, then I think it's probably more astute on your part to not be public and not be visible. Maybe now, 15, 20 years from now, maybe he could take public positions and express his views politically. But I think it's only been 2 years since he retired from office, from his presidency. So I think that's the reason why he hasn't been very public or publicly visible.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to keep our eyes on, I guess, is to see if he ultimately wants to play some sort of a role or somehow exerts his influence.
Although the opposition, the ruling parties are now, I think, provisionally agreed to look into, to examine the energy policies of Lee Myung-bak's government.
Oh, really?
Whether or not. Now, one of his major initiatives, Lee Myung-bak, when he was president, was to try to secure energy resources for the continued development of South Korean economy. And so there were many of the public energy companies in Korea made an effort to purchase or buy mines, for example, in developing countries to sort of strengthen energy security for South Korean government. Now, there have been current reporting by the mass media that maybe some of those deals were mishandled. The Korean government was not very astute in making these deals and lost considerable amount of public money.
Does that imply corruption or just mismanagement?
I don't think the criticism is because of potential corruption, although I think one of those deals there was accusations about possible corruption. But I think some of the media reporting has suggested that maybe the government is not as effective in making these deals and therefore lost money. So the ruling and the opposition party have agreed to open investigations and look at government policies and decisions regarding the energy security deals that the last administration made. So I think now, depending on what happens, he may be asked to testify. He may have to go public and try to maybe defend some of his initiatives during his administration.
You know, when you look at South Korea from externally, it seems to be doing so well. I mean, the big chaebol seem to be doing very well. Samsung, Kia, Hyundai, and others. And Korea is signing a never-increasing number of FTAs with other countries. But if you look internally, there seems to be a hollowing out of South Korea. And I hear more and more about concern about disparaging, how should I say, widening gaps in wealth, okay? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and that middle class is shrinking and shrinking. Yeah, I guess Korea, South Korea, like a lot of other countries afflicted with the same problem, really hasn't come up with a solution to that. Any ideas on that?
I think this is a growing concern.
Mm-hmm.
That there is growing economic inequality in South Korean society. The middle class is shrinking, even though the major business conglomerates are doing extremely well. That is not translating into more jobs, more well-paying jobs for the Korean people. So, so actually, if you look at the last presidential race, President Park Geun-hye, one of her major policies that she said that she would implement when if she's elected, it was to try to reduce this gap between the rich and the poor, and to strengthen the social welfare system, to generate more jobs, and possibly to promote policies, economic policies that would help to increase the small, medium business enterprises. So I think this is, I think everyone recognizes, as she clearly did when she was campaigning for the presidency, that somehow this problem needs to be addressed. So as president, one of her many economic initiatives is to try to encourage the growth of small, medium-sized enterprises in order to generate jobs, to try to foster a creative, what she has called the creative economy, applying ICT technology to increase productivity and to stimulate more venture-type companies opening and providing jobs. Also, she's pursuing economic deregulation and trying to carry various structural reforms to stimulate the services sector in order to generate more jobs. So, so we're 2 years into a presidency, and we'll just have to wait and see whether some of these major economic initiatives will help to address this problem.
Okay, well, we're going to take a break here. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Kim of the APCSS. It's the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Our show today is the Turbulent Peninsula, Korea. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Kim, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Just before the break, we were talking about the widening wealth gap in South Korea and the corresponding hollowing out of the economy. I was suggesting to Dr. Kim during the break that this situation reminds me a lot of Taiwan. Hollowing out the economy, political gridlock, seeking to create an economy that's more based on creativity. There's still a lot of struggles and a lot of problems going on.
If I could just add, I agree. I think, as economies, what has happened in Korea, I think is probably also occurring in Taiwan, which is that the manufacturing sector is no longer the source of new jobs.
Exactly.
Because of automation, because the major corporations have gone abroad to establish factories and manufacturing production. So therefore, what an advanced economy like Korea has to do, and I'm sure this also applies to Taiwan, is to create new growth engines. And really, manufacturing is no longer the place where you're going to increase the number of jobs. So the service sector, you have to develop the service sector, which means to create high-paying jobs for the increasing number of college graduates. So, but in order to develop the private the services sector, Korea has to open that sector up to foreign competition. It has to reduce some of the regulations. And this is proving to be politically difficult. So we'll have to wait and see next year how successful the government will be in creating more competitive and opening up the service sector to generate new source of jobs as a result of this hollowing out phenomenon in the South Korean economy.
As far as I can see, South Korea really hasn't shown a whole lot of interest in joining TPP either. It's been rather reticent about that.
Well, actually, that has changed very recently.
Oh, really?
The South Korean government has said it would like to join the TPP as soon as possible. And so it's really up to the countries that are involved in the negotiations now, whether they're willing to, and how fast they're willing to allow South Korea to join in the TPP negotiations. Now, that perception that maybe South Korea is reticent or not as enthusiastic about joining TPP, I think was because South Korea first wanted to sign an FTA with China. That was the top priority for, and rightly so, because China is such an important economic partner, a leading trade partner for South Korea. So the government wanted to concentrate and get that out of the way before joining, becoming one of the negotiating countries in the TPP negotiations. Now, since the FTA with China has been signed by the South Korean government, and I think even when they were still negotiating with China, South Korea said we're interested in TPP and we would like to at some point join in the negotiations. And I think South Korean government now believes that this is the right time. Timing is right, and they're really going to, I think, full press to try to join the TPP negotiations as soon as possible. So this is an important, is now, I think, one of the important goals as far as Korea signing FTAs or multilateral FTAs.
That's really good news. There was one other thing, one other area in which it seems to me that South Korea and Taiwan are very similar. Because in Taiwan, there's always a lot of talk about constitutional change, constitutional amendments. And it's always complicated because, well, what will America think? What will China think? And what kind of can of worms might it open domestically? Well, I don't suppose that Korea has to worry about China or America in terms of constitutional reform, but it seems would be opening a can of worms too. It would be very difficult to carry out as far as I can see. And I read things about like, well, in South Korea it's thought that the president has too much power and that maybe the position of the prime minister should be somewhat enhanced. In Taiwan, there's lots of concern that the president has too much power, that his power needs to be somehow curtailed or somehow checked, and that the role of the, in Taiwan they call it the premier, not the prime minister, the premier's power should somehow be enhanced somewhat. And from what I can tell, these arguments seem to be fairly similar in Korea.
I think there is, I think there is a partial overlap. I think many political analysts and experts are concerned about the imperial presidency, that maybe the Korean president's power needs to be curtailed somewhat and strengthen the position of the prime minister. But I think that is not the main focus of constitutional reform in South Korea. Really, the focus is on whether to change right now, under the Korean Constitution, the president serves one term, and only one term.
5 years.
5 years. I think there is a growing consensus that this has created various political problems, and therefore either South Korea should adopt a prime ministerial system like the one in England, or I think there is much more support for the idea of adopting the U.S. presidential system, meaning 2 terms, 2 consecutive, where a president can't have 2 consecutive terms, each term of 4 years. So in this way, the president, if he wants to serve a second term, like here in the U.S., he would have to be more responsive to the public, and think that overall this will create a more democratic and maybe a political system that is not as ridden by politics. So I think that is where the focus is as far as constitutional reform is concerned. So just recently, lawmakers from both the ruling and the opposition parties have formed a caucus to look into whether or not there should be constitutional reform and the reform of the presidential system. And I think the growing support for this idea of the kind of presidential system the U.S. government has.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's come on to international politics, South Korea from the international perspective. I tell you the truth, I'm confused about the relationship between the Republic of Korea and China. Where is it going? It seems like sometimes South Korea wants to chum up so much to China, and it's almost like, I sometimes get the perception it's sort of like, hey, well, the Americans pay so much attention to Japan, and they don't give us enough attention, so we're going to like chum up to China, sort of balance things out. Now, I don't know, maybe I have some misperception on my behalf, but where is the relationship between China and the Republic of Korea going?
I think from the South Korean point of view, it's going in a positive direction. Because of the importance of China as an economic partner of South Korea. I think, so therefore South Korea has a vested interest in trying to maintain good relations with China. Now, one other factor which is drawing the attention of the South Korean government as well as the Chinese government, and increasingly a feeling that there should be greater dialogue between South Korea and China, is obviously the North Korea and the growing danger of the nuclear conflict in the Korean Peninsula.
Okay.
Since 2008, North Korea has engaged in has escalated, and largely because I think they're trying to neutralize the external pressure on North Korea to accept a binding agreement to resolve the nuclear conflict. So since 2008, they've engaged in various provocations to try to get the other side to back down.
Right.
So as the danger on the Korean Peninsula grows, I think South Korea feels the need to engage in dialogue and trying to open lines of communication
with China,
with China,
okay.
so that maybe to find areas where South Korea and China can work together to try to tamp down the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, to try to exert some influence over the actions of North Korea, because those actions are increasing the danger of uncontrolled escalation in the Korean Peninsula. So,
I didn't
yeah,
mean
go
to-
ahead. Yeah.
It seems like that's a lot of the U.S. approach too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, okay, the U.S. always says, well, hey, North Korea, we go to China. But has China really come through? That's hard for me to see. And when I think of South Korea, I mean, the North Koreans sank the Cheonan a few years ago.
In 2010, yes.
China didn't say anything. I don't know, you're the Korean expert here, so you tell me, has there been one instance where China has really used its influence over North Korea in a manner that satisfied South Korea?
Well, as a result of the sinking of Chung-hee in 2010, which was a major provocation by North Korea,
Right.
China, in fact, took sort of a stance in which they tried to, in which they urged both sides to calm down, and was perceived by many as providing some sort of a diplomatic cover for the provocation by North Korea. For example, China, according to the press reports at the time, China was trying to moderate possible potential sanctions by the Security Council, and was perceived not only by U.S. and South Korea, but by the international community that China was in fact creating an environment, or China was contributing to North Korean provocations by not using some of the influence they have to try to prevent North Korea from engaging in dangerous acts of escalation. So I think, and actually, I think for the first time, China really bore the brunt of international criticism, as well as negative South Korean public opinion. At the time, I remember very distinctly, the Secretary Clinton of U.S. said, you know what, she said, condemned, actually, the efforts perceived by many as providing a diplomatic cover for North Korea, and she said that this is actually contributing to encouraging North Korea to engage in provocations because they're not clamping down hard enough to prevent North Korea. So she said China is not part of the problem. Okay. So I think that was an important turning point for China. And they realized, I think, that if North Korea continues to go down the path, increasing tensions by various provocations, then China will increasingly become the focus of international criticism for being complicit and for not doing its part in controlling this escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, we're going to take another break here. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Kim of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Our show today is titled The Turbulent Peninsula, Korea, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. I'm host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is our flagship show, which plays 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. And the supporters of that show are Hawaii Energy Policy Forum and Hawaii Energy. And luckily enough, we have representatives of both of them right here today to tell you more about what they think about the show. Sharon Moriwaki at my left is co-chair of Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, and she goes first. Sharon?
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. I'm so glad that we have this Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. This was 2 years ago when we started this, and we have continued it because it's so important, and there's so many developments happening across the state. And we hope you'll tune in every Wednesday, 4 to 5. It's wonderful.
And Ray is Hawaii Energy. Ray, what is your thought about the same subject?
Well, I agree completely with Sharon that we are talking about every Wednesday, 4 to 5. We talk about some of the most important subjects that are affecting the islands now and into the future. Energy, clean energy, we need it. We often run into new ideas that we had not thought about before. We did just today, and I think we're going to have more of that in the future. So come on down and watch us 4 to 5 on Wednesdays, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see you then. Aloha.
Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Kim of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Our show today is titled The Turbulent Peninsula, Korea. And just before the break, we were talking about the fact that we're discussing the question, has China really done anything to help South Korea curb North Korea's erratic behavior? And so I think we'll pick it up from there.
China, I think, is, in addition to the Chung-hee incident, the third nuclear test by North Korea in the early part of 2013, I think has raised the stakes for China. And I think the Chinese have come to the realization that they need to, they haven't taken any forceful actions, at least publicly, to try to control or influence the decisions being made by Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, although they claim that behind the scenes, they're actually putting pressure on North Korea to prevent North Korea from doing anything to further escalate the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. But I think all the experts, both within China, now believe that China can no longer, China can no longer just sit by idly and allow North Korea to escalate and create a dangerous situation on the Korean Peninsula. So China, so the relationship between North Korea and China has changed. And I think China is now, at least publicly, in the statements made by the Chinese government, the Chinese leaders, I think are telling North Korea that they should not escalate, they should not raise tensions, and that this will invite or will force China to take actions that might not be so favorable toward North Korea. So that is the impression, that is what they are saying. And for the first time, and I think this is quite significant, the Chinese government has said they cannot tolerate, will not tolerate a nuclear-armed North Korea. President Xi Jinping said that when he held a summit with President Obama, and he has said the same thing, maybe not exactly in those words, when he held a summit with President Park Geun-hye. So I think the terrain has changed, and I think China is now telling North Korea that it needs to moderate its actions if they're going to continue to have relations with China.
And also, you were talking about a change in Chinese thinking, and I think that since the 18th Party Congress, which was, what, 2 years ago now, you have a new standing committee in the Politburo, and on that Politburo, you have some people that really have some understanding of Korea. One, in fact, studied at Kim Il-sung University. I would assume his Korean is pretty good. You also have a foreign minister, Wang Yi, who's spent his whole career specializing on Korean or Asian affairs. And so I think it's a leadership that's much more, has a much deeper understanding of Korea. And it's a stronger Politburo standing committee, not as divided as the last one. So that's pretty interesting, I think, a really interesting change in mindset. At the same time, China has extensive interest in North Korea. They have, a large part of the northeastern part of North Korea is essentially contracted out to China. There are lots of leases on mines. Jiang Song-taek, one argument for his demise was he was too involved with China. And Kim Jong-un, I don't think, liked that because he felt that they went around him completely on China issues. And I understand now that Kim Jong-un is going to Moscow in May and trying to strike up a new relationship with Russia. There's some changes going on here.
The Putin government has invited Kim Jong-un. There has been no official response from the North Korean government. And I think,
right?
absolutely, yeah, that's right. So the invitation has been issued. Now, At the same time, the Russian government has also announced that they've issued an invitation to Park Geun-hye, President of South Korea, to join in the celebration of the end of World War II celebrations in Russia. Guess who else they invited to Moscow? They've invited President Obama to join. So potentially, if all three accept that invitation, they will all be in Moscow sometime May of next year.
What's Russia's motive? To reassert itself in Asia?
Well, I think Russia has made it clear, or President Putin has made it clear that Russia wants to be a player in Asia.
Right.
And they have their own sort of rebalancing strategy to increase their influence and to promote closer economic ties. They want to access to the energy markets of South Korea and Japan, and therefore North Korea now figures prominently in their calculations in trying to develop closer economic ties, trying to benefit from possible South Korean Japanese investment in developing the Far East. So I think that may be one of the reasons why Putin is trying to invite both the South Korean leader and the North Korean leader to join in the celebrations. Now, all of their economic interest in North Korea really cannot be fully realized unless there is stability on the Korean Peninsula. Unless there's no further escalation or worsening of the nuclear conflict in the Korean Peninsula. They can't realize their economic interest unless, of course, the North Korean regime decides to open up, maybe carry out economic reform. So all of the economic interest of the Russian government hinges on whether or not there is stability, whether or not the six-party talks, the process can start over, re-energized. So therefore, I think that's one of the reasons why he's decided to invite both the South Korean and the North Korean leaders.
That's very interesting.
To the May celebrations, and of course, U.S. This may be because U.S. and Russia have their own problems.
Right, they have their own set of problems.
Yeah, and I think the Chinese also have definitely economic interest in North Korea. I think.
Sure, absolutely.
So they want to, I think, develop the northeastern part of China, which really has suffered, and part of the economic revival of that region partially depends on whether or not, for example, they're able to modernize the port facilities at NASA, so the Chinese can use it as an outlet.
Access to the sea.
Access to the sea. And from the Russian point of view, Mongolia is also interesting because that would also enable them. They want to be a partner in maybe developing in economic investments in North Korea so that they can also have an outlet to the sea. Russia would like the NASA port facilities to be a point where South Koreans conglomerates can ship their goods to Nasan, and from Nasan it'd be carried by railroad through Russia all the way to Europe.
So, this idea has been around a long time. So
but,
many roadblocks, at least up to this point.
But now there is, I think there has been considerable progress. And even the South Korean conglomerates are now interested in, they've actually even become involved in developing NASA by investing in the Russian company that is in charge of developing the infrastructure at NASA. And just a short while ago, Russia shipped their coal from to Nasan by train because now they've connected one of the cities bordering the border with North Korea, and they've laid the railway line. So the Russians just recently sent a shipment of coal. This is just to test, and from there at Nasan, they put that on a vessel and a vessel brought the coal to Pohang, where the major steel facility is located. And so this is opening up some very interesting developments as far as encouraging also economic cooperation.
I remember a few years ago, there was all the reports in the paper about how these Russian railway workers were in North Korea. They were fixing broken down, fixing parts of track and replacing railway ties. And it seems like this is all fits together. You
Yes.
fix the railways, and then you can move the goods, and they're moving the goods, or about them. Sounds like they're about to move the goods. We're coming down here to our last 5 minutes or so, and for the benefit of our audience will be very upset with us, I'm sure, if we do not talk about the interview. And what's your take on the interview? Should it have been made? Did Sony balk? Should it have gone ahead and released it? There's reports on the internet today that North Korea's internet system is completely down, and no fingers have been pointed to the United States yet, but I'm sure that's just a matter of time before that happens. What's your take on all this? Besides wanting to see the movie.
I don't think it's going to help matters on the Korean Peninsula as far as the turbulence is concerned regarding the Korean Peninsula. This has opened up a new front, a potential source of friction between U.S. and North Korea, which I think is going to possibly raise tensions. So I think the U.S. government has formally accused North Korea of being behind these cyber attacks on Sony. And the U.S. government has said that they will take proportional actions against North Korea. And the fact, and so, of course, some people are speculating now with the collapse of the internet, the North Korean internet, that possibly this could be one of the actions maybe carried out by the American government. This is all speculation at this point.
Sure.
But it's unfortunate. I think and just recently there have been cyber attacks against Korean nuclear power plants, where somebody has hacked into and has made stolen.
North Korean nuclear plants or South Korean? Just to be absolutely clear.
These are South Korean nuclear power plants. So somebody hacked into South Korean nuclear plants and stole information which they have now made public. For example, the designs of the South Korean nuclear power plants, and that is now in the public domain, which is, I think, a serious breach of the security.
Right.
The South Korean government hasn't made any announcement. It's under investigation, but many people fear that possibly North Korea could be behind the attacks, because North Korea has carried out various cyber attacks, 2009, 2011, as recently as early part of 2013, when the South Korean government officially accused North Korea of launching ATP attacks against major banks, media companies, in which they immobilized the computers, as well as deleting information. So given the track record of North Korean cyber attacks against South Korean government as well as private websites, many experts, South Korean experts, believe that possibly South Korea could be behind these cyber intrusions.
North Korea.
North Korea.
North Korea. Okay.
So the cyber is now has opened up a new front. North Korea is bent on developing cyber capabilities, and those capabilities are increasing, and therefore this is another worrisome factor
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Well, we've about come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Stephen
Thank
Kim,
you.
for being with us today. I certainly learned a lot in the last 45 minutes. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week right here on ThinkTech Asia. Goodbye, and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.